All right, we are doing worksheet 1-8, and I have to look at the one uh, printed in the book because creating these blank spaces for where we're to put a note, uh, so that may make me pause on a few. Let's look at the sample. It shows a quarter and an eighth. Uh, it has a space. On this, it shows a rest for where the spaces are. So there was a space here, only that's an eighth rest, only room for an eighth note. Now you have a blank spot, so you have to deduce that it's an eighth note is the only appropriate solution. Um, we have a blank spot here, and blank spot here, all solved by quarter notes. So here's everything filled in. Now remember, it's one note. So when we go to the second line, we have a blank. I have a rest printed right here. So I'm going to enter a quarter note. That happens to be treble clef B4, the last note before the C5 octave. Boy, that's fascinating, I'm sure. Okay, you have a blank spot here where this half rest is, so I'm going to put a half note there. One note. You don't put two quarter notes. You got to mark yourself wrong. Only answer is a half note. And this is middle line B, so if you want to put stems up, either direction is fair. Okay, in the next measure, there is a blank, the second half of the measure, there's a 2-beat rest, and so we're going to put a half note here. Nothing in the last measure, so the only rhythm that's going to fill the whole measure is a whole note. Okay, on to the next line, and we are in the meter of 2/8, so you have to understand there are only 2/8 notes and a measure is full. Now I show the blank spots with rests, and the rests also give away what is the answer. So we put an eighth note here. We had a blank spot here. We put an eighth note here. Now, in the third measure, there's an eighth rest printed and then a blank, so I only put an eighth here. And in the last measure, it's just the opposite. The rest is printed here, so I put an eighth note there. Okay, the next line, we are in 4/8. And so you have 1, 2, 3/8, and where I have the rest is your blank spot. That makes 4/8. That measure's full. Now in the next measure, you have an eighth rest printed, blank, eighth. So the rest is correct. We need to put a single note right there. All right, the quarter rest, of course, is the most difficult to draw by hand, but you're not having to worry about drawing rests, just filling the space with notes. So in this next measure, you have a quarter and then a quarter rest. Now an eighth note would be incorrect because we need to only write one note and fill 2/8 notes worth of time. So the answer is a quarter note, like the rest indicates. And in the last measure, the same thing. A quarter note is the answer in that blank spot. Okay, now this will be hard to understand because we're used to seeing a whole note fill a whole measure, but this is 4/2, which means every measure has 4 half notes. That means double whole notes. You have one blank, and so the answer is only a whole note in that blank. Now, you have in the next measure, you have a blank, and then you have a half or a 2-beat rest, and you have a half note. So once again, now I have to make room for this, I've got to erase these and now try to wedge this guy in here. There. And that is the correct answer. I'm going to have to do a similar thing, only I have to just get rid of the last rest. So grab the eraser and we've got 4 half notes worth between the res and the tied over half note. So just a half note there is the answer. In the last measure is like the first measure. You have a whole note, so another whole note is the answer. 4/2, once again, means 4 half notes per measure. There are 2 half notes in each whole note. Okay. Is that a rare meter? Yeah. Should it be this early in the class? No, but we're that's what we're dealing with. Okay. 3/4. I show 2/4 rests, but I have to fill those with a single rhythm. So the half note is the answer, but I think I'm going to have to erase these before it will let me put a half note in there. Okay, and then in the next measure, you have a half note on the tail end of the measure tied over, so we need a quarter note like the rest suggests. In the next measure, you have the quarter note tied over, but this is all blank, so I got to get rid of this and put. Now, if I put 2 quarter notes, you got to mark. If you put 2 quarter notes, you have to mark yourself wrong. You have to solve these with 1 note. So we're just going to put a half note there. And then in the last measure, all that's missing is there's a blank where this 8th rest is. So that means 8th note is the only answer right there. Now you have a flagged 8th note printed, so you got to put a flag on this one. Finale automatically beams them when they appear in pairs or quads or what have you. Okay, now in this measure, the blank is a quarter note. We have a quarter note rest, so I just need to plug in a quarter note there. In the next measure, there is nothing shown but a quarter note on the tail end of the measure. So I get rid of this rest. It's in the wrong spot. And I'm going to put a half note, a dotted half note here. See if it'll let me do it or if I have to erase it. Okay, so that is the only answer for measure 2. Measure 3 is just the opposite, but I'm going to have to clear the rests out of the way to do it. Bingo. And then for the last measure, all we need is a half note. Okay, 2/4, the equivalent of 2 quarter notes per measure. You have a blank where this 8th rest is, so that's the answer. An 8th note has to go right there. And you'll be drawing a flagged 8th note once again. All right, there's only room for an 8th note where this 8th rest is. That fills that measure. There's only room for an 8th note here. And there's room, we have to solve it with 1 note. There's room for a quarter note here. Last line. I have cut time, but that's the same as 2/2, and it still has 4 quarter notes per measure. It's just conducted differently, so don't worry about that. So we have a half note shown. The half rest tells us the answer. We need a half note here. We have 2 quarter notes. Once again, we have an empty space. We have a rest shown, or I have a rest shown. Half note, back half of the measure, like so. Same thing in the third measure, half note. Now in the last measure, it's completely blank, so a half note would not do it. We need a whole note. All right, so that's pretty simple. Thank you.